Hello. So I just finished with a 8-day retreat where I was reading part of the second volume of Geshe Sopa's Steps on the Path to Enlightenment, which is, as a lot of people here know, is his commentary on Tsongkhapa's Lamrim. And this volume is mostly about karma and its results, but it includes the topic of suffering, that is, recognizing the suffering nature of cyclic existence, which is mostly the part I was studying in. I would read a section and then go back over it and type up a summary. And much of this summary is taken word for word, extracting sentences or parts of sentences from the original text. And some of it is slightly reworded or paraphrased. And I've read this book several times. I love it. There's Geshe-la there. And I've read it several times, but in those 8 days I covered 72 pages. That might not seem like a lot. And I came up with about 39 pages of summary, because I was trying to do small, but I ended up with more than, that's more than half of 72. And the summary itself, which I do find handy for a review, is not the point. The point is that I find this an effective way to have me going back over the material repeatedly and contemplating the meaning so that I can decide what goes in the summary. And I was doing 4 meditation sessions a day, going over some of this material in detail and trying to relate it to my life experiences. Geshe Sopa says, you should meditate on these points over and over again. And throughout the text, he says that over and over again. You bet. And here's one way he puts it. Without meditating on these points, change will be difficult. These new concepts must be pushed to the front of the mind where they have the force to affect the way you think and act in your daily life. Otherwise, you read or hear some explanation of karma and you think, yes, I've heard about that, and it settles somewhere in the back of your mind. But if you do not focus on this explanation in meditation, it will not have the necessary reinforcement to bring about change. If you do not meditate on karma and its results in this way, your habitual behavior will just go on, rolling downhill like a ball of string. And generally with the BBCs, we try not to rely too heavily on the quotes, but I want to share some of what I've been going over, so I pulled excerpts from this summary and put them together to show the progression from the practitioner of the small scope to the being of intermediate scope to the being of great scope, as this is how the Lamrim is laid out. So I'm going to read some of his quotes and make some comments of my own on it. How do you determine when you have actually acquired the attitude of being of small scope? What is your attitude like at that point? In the past, you have always had an interest in this life. You didn't need to make any effort or do any special practices to acquire an interest in living a long and happy life, acquiring wealth, fame, pleasure, and praise, the basis of the 8 worldly concerns. Any concern you had for future lives or higher rebirths, any interest you showed in the teachings, spiritual friends, and virtuous practice was merely a weak, vague interest that was temporarily aroused by hearing the words of others or from reading books. That really resounds with how my life was for a long time. It was not a spontaneous, uncontrived interest that arose from deep in your heart. You have achieved the attitude of the person of small scope when these priorities are reversed, when your highest concern is acquiring a good rebirth in your next life, and your interest in affairs of this life are secondary. When concern for what will happen in your next life spontaneously and naturally dominates your thoughts and actions, then you are on the path of the person of small scope. He says at one point, until then you're not on the path of the inferior scope, you're inferior to that. Just a little harsh. But meaning that, if we're focused on this life, then that's not spiritual practice. For every samsaric rebirth, no matter how high, there is always the possibility of falling back into a suffering realm because you remain under the power of karma and the afflictions. In every such rebirth, you will have to make an energetic effort to prevent the possibility of a lower rebirth. Therefore, you have to look further. You need to start thinking about the next steps on the path. These are the trainings common to the person of the intermediate scope. This type of practitioner is striving for freedom from all future rebirth conditioned by karma and afflictions, regardless of how high or low, because such rebirths offer no certainty about what will happen in the future. The person who strives for complete emancipation from cyclic existence is the being of intermediate scope. Now, this text does not just define the thought one must produce to be a being of the intermediate scope. It very extensively goes over how to produce such an attitude through presenting material to study, reflect on, and meditate on. It teaches how to produce such an attitude and emphasizes the need to continue to strengthen that attitude once it arises and to live by it. So here's some of that kind of material, actually. Equally disenchanted with all of samsaric existence, the wise produce a fervent desire to get out of this cycle of misery altogether. Most humans are so attached to the splendors of samsara that they sacrifice their entire life trying to attain them. You become accustomed to imputing a nature of attractiveness upon those samsaric delights. You invest them with an ability to deliver bliss and contentment. This hopeless pursuit of happiness in the wrong places, this habitual projection of unreal expectations on worldly objects, this is the real problem. The antidote to that habitual mistaken way of thinking is to meditate on suffering. You must cultivate a correct perception of the nature of those worldly delights by meditating on how many ways in which they bring only disappointment and sorrow. You must concentrate on their faults. This is the reverse of the ordinary mode of perception. Ordinarily, you see impure things as pure, impermanent things as permanent, and objects whose nature it is to bring suffering as sources of happiness. The antidote is to use discriminating wisdom to analyze their true nature, and by means of meditation to accustom your mind to perceiving that truth, their nature of being impure, impermanent, and causes of suffering. Once your perceptions are cleansed and your mind is accustomed to this truth, you will naturally turn away from these false attractions, and in doing so you will eliminate the causes of suffering. You should meditate on these points over and over again until you produce a genuine, heartfelt sense of sorrow and disenchantment with the worldly concerns that have occupied you up till now. When that happens, hold on to that feeling and use it to propel your practice. Continue to do these meditations until you have generated the genuine, spontaneous thought of renunciation. If you have not yet felt this attitude of disenchantment that comes from seeing the faults of this whole situation, then a genuine, uncontrived thought of renunciation will not arise. Without that thought, you will not be inspired to work towards liberation. And if you haven't produced a sincere thought of renunciation, wanting freedom from samsara for yourself, there will be no way to produce the determination to free all sentient beings, which, as we know, is the attitude of the being of the great scope, the bodhisattva aspiration. Also, although we aspire to be on that path, until we have even turned our focus away from this life, we haven't even got on the path in common with the lesser aspiration. So the famous Kadampa Geshe Potova said, "Wherever we are born among the 6 types of beings, suffering will arise, such as sickness and death. When there is a cause for sickness, there will be sickness. When the cause of death appears, we will die. These do not arise as some sort of unsuitable or accidental events. It is the very character or nature of cyclic existence. As long as we abide within cyclic existence, there is no escaping it. If we are disgusted by this, we must eliminate birth. For that, we must eliminate its causes. What is the cause? Karma and afflictions. They must be eliminated from the root, and you do that by applying the antidotes as they are explained here in the steps of the path to enlightenment. So this is why we study and meditate on suffering right after karma, because seeing the suffering nature of our objects of attachment is a powerful antidote to that attachment. And that attachment, along with aversion and ignorance, is what propels our karma. Seeing the ignorance involved in attachment and aversion both helps us to develop a determination to abandon such afflictions. So under the section on the fault of uncertainty, Geshe Sopa says, out of ignorance, your mind perceives someone as an enemy. All kinds of negative thoughts about that person arise, and you generate fierce anger and hatred. But in reality, there's nothing essential that makes that person your enemy. It is merely a temporary perception or imputation based on transient causes and conditions. It is the same with those that you love. You perceive their closeness to you as their true ultimate nature, and this brings attachment. But here too, nothing is permanent. Eventually, everything turns around. The afflictions of attachment, anger, and jealousy instigate a vast amount of harmful actions, committed without any understanding of who you are attacking and who you are defending. There is no comprehension that the relationship with your worst enemies and your best friends are constantly changing, that there is not a single relationship in cyclic existence that you can establish firmly, rely on, or trust. Even within this one short life, everything changes back and forth. Friends become enemies, and enemies become friends, and you have no control over it. Meditating on this, you should prevent the arising of attachment and hostility, which develop from making false distinctions between friends and enemies. You should recognize that there is nothing stable in cyclic existence. This will enable you to produce disenchantment with samsara as sincere thought of renunciation. This is the main thing. You should direct your mind in the virtuous direction. This means cultivating a feeling of caring, concern, friendship, and equanimity towards all living beings. Such feelings grow naturally when you realize that all beings are enmeshed in suffering as a result of sharing this rudimentary misunderstanding about how the world is constantly changing. Not realizing that all relationships and objects they rely on for their happiness are ultimately going to disappoint them. Once you gain a glimpse of this reality, you want to free yourself from that situation. You also want to help others because you see that they are stuck in the same condition. That attitude is the basis for virtuous action. That is the direction in which you want to turn your mind. So as you can see from this little bit of the text, 72 pages contain more than enough material to occupy one for 8 days and much more. And that, this need to meditate on this over and over.